Story number 1. The room that shouldn't exist. There are places in this world that shouldn't exist. Rooms hidden deep within houses, behind walls no one remembers putting up, where time itself seems to have a different meaning. That's where they found themselves, trapped and confused. 5 strangers with no clear reason for being there. It was late afternoon when they first stumbled into the house. They had no idea how they'd ended up there, no recollection of the paths that led them to the front door. But there it was, standing dark and silent, like a long-forgotten relic from a past no one could recall. The door had creaked open as soon as one of them, a man named Thomas, touched the handle. The others, Amanda, Claire, James, and Ben, had stood frozen behind him, each unsure if they should be stepping inside. But in the end, they all did. They were curious more than anything, and perhaps a little desperate. The inside of the house was strange. It had that musty old smell, the kind of scent that made your skin crawl, like it had been sealed off for decades. Dust hung in the air, floating lazily through shafts of pale light that filtered in from dirty windows. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling like forgotten memories. They wandered from room to room, exploring the forgotten place. It wasn't large, yet it felt endless, like the rooms were shifting when they weren't looking. The house seemed to breathe, its floors creaking underfoot, and the walls groaning as if they were alive, holding secrets they'd never share. That's when they found the door. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden behind a tapestry that had seen better days. No one had noticed it at first. It was only when Amanda, in her usual reckless way, pulled the tapestry aside that they saw it. A small, unmarked wooden door, almost invisible in its plainness. "Should we?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling like she knew better but couldn't stop herself. "I don't know. Something about it feels wrong," James said, his voice tight with unease. But Ben, the curious one, reached for the handle. It turned easily under his fingers, the door creaking open like a breath exhaled after years of waiting. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to drift up from below, though none of them could understand what was being said. "I don't think this is a good idea," Thomas muttered, but it was already too late. One by one, they descended, their footsteps muffled against the thick carpet that lined the stairs. At the bottom, they found themselves in a room that shouldn't have existed. It was square, with no windows, no doors, except the one they had come through. The walls were covered in dark, cracked tiles, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence that pressed in on them. It wasn't just the room that was wrong, it was everything. As soon as the door slammed shut behind them, locking itself with a soft, final click, the lights flickered once, then went out completely. They were plunged into darkness, their breaths loud in the heavy air. "Who locked it?" Claire's voice quivered. No one answered. They didn't need to. They tried the door. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in quickly. Thomas kicked at the wood, but it didn't give. They screamed, pounded on the walls, but the room stayed quiet, unnervingly so. There was no escape. As the hours passed, the whispers began. Faint at first, but louder as time went on. At first, it was just a murmur, barely audible. Then it grew clearer, more distinct. The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, the very space around them vibrating with a mournful tone. "Help us," the voices would say. It was never meant to be. "What is this place?" Amanda whispered, her voice small, fearful. No one could answer. Time lost all meaning. Hours stretched into days. They no longer knew if the sun had ever risen or set. The room became their entire world. Food ran out quickly, and water was scarce, but they couldn't leave. There was no escape. Their skin grew pale, their eyes hollow. The fear wasn't just physical, it was mental, clawing at them, pulling at their sanity. They began to see things, visions that weren't there. At first, it was just shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, but soon it was more than that. James saw a figure, a tall, thin man standing by the far wall, his eyes dark and hollow, staring at him without blinking. "James, you don't remember, do you?" the figure whispered. "You belong here. You always have." James screamed, backing away, but the figure didn't move. It just stayed there, staring. The others saw things too. Ben saw his childhood home burning, the fire swallowing everything. Claire saw a man she didn't know, someone in her life who had long since passed. Their minds were unraveling, and with each passing hour they were losing their grip on reality. And then, the nightmares began. They started with a feeling, a coldness that seeped into their bones. A whisper that wasn't just in their ears, but inside their heads, telling them things they didn't want to hear. The house had a past, a tragic one, full of death and despair. It had claimed people before just like them. Strangers, lost souls who wandered in and never left. Days blended into each other. The room felt more like a tomb, each moment stretching longer than the last. No one spoke much anymore. They had all begun to question whether they would ever leave. The house was alive. Alive in ways they couldn't understand. And it had been waiting for them. It was as if the house had been built on a foundation older than time itself. A dark secret buried beneath the earth, calling out for more souls to join the ones already trapped within. And maybe that's what they were now, souls, trapped in a place that should never have existed, unable to escape, their bodies just waiting to join the others who had come before. They had become part of the house, part of its history, and in the end they would all be forgotten. Forgotten by time, forgotten by the world. But the house would never forget, it would wait. And when the next strangers came wandering through its doors, it would pull them in, just as it had pulled them. And the cycle would begin again. It was, after all, a place that shouldn't exist. Story number 2. The Whispering Stairs. Lena had never been one to believe in ghosts, or at least, that's what she told herself whenever the thought crept in, like a shadow slipping just out of sight. She was the kind of person who needed answers. Answers to everything. So, when she found herself standing at the gates of the Winchester Mystery House, she told herself it was no different than any other place of strange rumors and eerie tales. After all, she was here to confront something much more personal than ghosts. For as long as she could remember, Lena had been haunted. Not by apparitions, but by memories. Her childhood home was a place she couldn't forget, filled with echoes of long-forgotten arguments, faces she could no longer recognize, and the feeling of something wrong that she couldn't place. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was just a teenager, leaving her with questions she never got to ask, and a deep, gnawing feeling that something had been taken from her. That feeling had never gone away. Her visit to the Winchester house wasn't about ghosts. It was about finding something. Something that could explain why the past refused to release her, why her mind kept circling back to those memories, even though she had tried everything to move on. She had read about the house, of course, the endless rooms, the doors leading to nothing, the staircase that defied logic. There were so many oddities in that house it was almost too perfect for someone like her, someone searching for answers. When Lena entered the mansion, she was surprised by how ordinary it looked inside. The faded wallpaper, the dusty floors, the smell of something ancient lingering in the air. It felt like an old house, the kind that had seen too many years pass by. holding secrets in the cracks of its wood and stone. The tour guide was speaking in hushed tones about the history, the peculiarities of the place, but Lena's attention was drawn to something else. It was a staircase, small, almost hidden behind a set of velvet curtains, just beyond a narrow hallway. The tour guide mentioned it briefly, the stairs that led nowhere, the stairs that no one could explain. There was a sense of unease in the room as the guide spoke, like everyone else in the group could feel it too, but they didn't know why. Curiosity gnawed at Lena. She slipped away from the group, unnoticed, and made her way toward the stairs. The wood creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step groaning as though the house itself was reluctant to let her go higher. There was no door at the top, no room behind it, just a wall that seemed to have been sealed long ago. But the stairs themselves felt wrong. She couldn't explain it. It was as though the air around them was thicker, heavier, charged with something that didn't belong. As she took her first step, a faint whisper brushed against her ear. She froze. The sound was soft, barely a whisper at all, but it was there. Come closer. Lena felt her heart speed up. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe the sound of the house settling, but deep down she knew better. She wasn't alone on these stairs. Someone was here with her. She took another step. Closer. The whisper came again. This time, clearer, more insistent. It was coming from the top of the stairs, from the darkness beyond the empty wall. The voice was soft but unyielding, a tug at her soul. You must take the final step. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She felt her feet moving forward before she could stop herself. Drawn by the voice, pulled by something older than her own will. She didn't understand why, but every instinct in her told her she needed to keep going. There was something she needed to know at the top of these stairs. Something that would make sense of the ache that had been with her all her life. As she reached the top, the whispers grew louder, overlapping now, murmuring in frantic tones. Take it. Take the final step. Lena's hands shook. She didn't want to go further, but the whispers, no, the voices, were inside her head now. They were like hands, pushing her forward, urging her to finish what had started. And then, just as she was about to step forward, a sharp, cold chill ran through her, seizing her chest with a vice-like grip. The room before her seemed to twist, the walls rippling like water, and she heard another voice, louder, more distinct this time. Leave, it commanded. Lena recoiled, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. For the first time, she realized the whispers weren't welcoming her, they were warning her. The house wasn't calling her up the stairs to give her answers. It was trapping her, pulling her into its secrets, its lies. But the house wasn't just a building, it was alive. Alive in a way that twisted the air and pulled at the threads of her mind. Lena backed away slowly, her legs shaking, and she turned to run. But the stairs seemed longer now, stretching before her like an endless drop. It wasn't the house that wanted her. It was the whispers, the voices that had been trapped here for so long, waiting for someone to listen, to hear their story. Lena turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and fled from the stairs. But the whispers followed her. She could still hear them, soft but persistent, even as she left the house behind. You'll be back, the voice whispered in her ear. They always come back. Lena left the Winchester house that day, but it never left her. She would dream of those stairs, the ones that led nowhere, the ones that promised answers but delivered only darkness. The whispers had followed her, as they had followed others, always there, always waiting. And Lena knew, deep in her bones, that no matter how far she ran, the whispers would never stop. They would always be there, waiting to draw her back. Story number 3. The Phantom Builder. Gregory Winters was a man of reason. He was an architect by trade, a practical, logical thinker who prided himself on finding the truth behind every structure. When he first heard about the Winchester Mystery House, he'd brushed it off as nothing more than a strange oddity, a house built by a grieving widow with too much money and too little sense. But when he visited, something about it got under his skin. The place was a labyrinth. Doors that opened into walls, stairs that led to nowhere, hallways that twisted back on themselves like a maze, making no sense at all. Gregory, with all his years of training, couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of the design. And yet, there was something wrong about it. Like a mistake that had been buried deep within the house's bones, a flaw no one could understand. He returned to the house again and again, studying the plans, retracing Sarah Winchester's steps as she had designed the mansion. She'd supposedly been guided by spirits, they said, who told her to build forever, as a way of appeasing the ghosts of those killed by her husband's rifle. But Gregory didn't believe in spirits. He believed in lines and measurements, in blueprints and symmetry. And yet, the house seemed to defy every rule he knew. One night, as Gregory sat in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp illuminating the old blueprints spread out before him. His eyes grew heavy. His hand hovered above the paper, pencil in hand, as he traced the bizarre patterns once again. That's when the dream started. It wasn't a pleasant dream. It was cold and dark, the kind that made you wake up with your heart pounding. There was a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light. Tall, thin, wearing a dusty old suit, the man's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, his hands long and spindly, as if they weren't entirely human. In the dream, the figure spoke to him, his voice low and gravelly, like stone scraping against stone. "You don't understand it, do you?" the figure said. "But I can show you. I can show you how it all fits together." Gregory woke up with a start, his body drenched in sweat. His heart was racing, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still in the dream or if it had been real. His eyes darted around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The blueprints were still there, scattered on the desk. The house, in his mind, loomed large, casting its shadow over him, as though it were alive and watching. The next night, the dream returned. This time, the figure was standing closer, just at the edge of his bed, watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. The whispers came again, muffled at first, then clearer. I guided her hand. I helped her build it all. You want to understand, don't you? Gregory woke up again, his breath shallow, his body rigid with fear. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the house, that damn house, was somehow bleeding into his mind. The dreams were no longer just dreams. They were becoming real. The next day, Gregory couldn't stop thinking about it. His obsession grew deeper. He returned to the house, alone this time, sneaking through the narrow hallways, retracing Sarah Winchester's steps with the fervor of a man possessed. The further he explored, the more he felt it. The shifting, the changing of the house around him. The way the rooms didn't make sense, the way the stairs twisted unnaturally, the way the hallways stretched on without end. It was as if the house was reacting to him, shifting its bones like some living thing. And then he saw it. The figure. The Phantom Builder. Standing at the end of a hallway, bathed in the dim light of the house's flickering lamps. Gregory froze. His breath caught in his throat. There was no doubt this time. The figure was real. He stepped closer, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move. The figure turned toward him, its face still hidden beneath the brim of its hat, but Gregory could feel its gaze, cold and relentless. "You're here now," the figure said, its voice like the sound of grinding wood. "You want to know why she built this place, why she couldn't stop." Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind was spinning, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had come here for answers, but what he was getting was something much darker. The figure began to move, stepping toward him with long, measured strides, its feet barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. "This house is a prison," it said, its voice now echoing in the empty hallways. "Sarah Winchester built it because she was told to, but it was never just her who was guided. I showed her how to build, how to trap them all inside." Gregory's heart pounded in his chest. The walls seemed to be closing in, the house shifting around him, warping, changing, as if it were alive, breathing. The doors, the windows, the very architecture seemed to be warping and twisting, as if the house itself were shifting, moving in response to the figure's presence. "Who are you?" Gregory finally managed to whisper, his voice shaking. The figure's face slowly tilted upward, and for the first time, Gregory saw its eyes. Cold, empty sockets, dark and hollow. "I am the one who built this place," it said, "and I will never leave." The floor beneath Gregory's feet trembled, the air thickening as the figure raised its hand, pointing toward the endless maze of the house. "This house is more than a place. It is a prison," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "And you, Gregory Winters, have come too close. You wanted to understand, but now you will become part of it. You will help me finish what she started." Gregory's legs gave out beneath him. He fell to the floor, his mind scrambling to process the impossible, the supernatural horror that had gripped him. But the figure wasn't finished. It was never finished. And as Gregory lay there, paralyzed by fear, he understood the truth. The house wasn't just a house. It was a curse, a living, breathing curse that had been built with blood and death, and it had claimed every soul that dared to enter. Now, it was claiming his. The house was alive, and it would never stop watching. Story number 4. The Mirror That Shows Your Death. David Hall had always been a skeptic. A man of logic and reason, he didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or the supernatural. He believed in facts, in science, in the things you could touch and measure. So, when he heard the legend about the mirror in the old house, he laughed it off. He had to. It was just a story, something passed around by people who loved to believe in the unbelievable. The house was known for its oddities, its bizarre architecture, and the strange rumors that swirled around it like the dust in its forgotten corners. There were tales of doors that led to nowhere, stairs that ascended into thin air, and windows that looked out onto nothing. But the one legend that caught David's attention was the mirror. They said that one of the house's mirrors, the oldest one, had the power to show the reflection of the person who looked into it at the moment of their death. A death that hadn't yet happened, but one that was fated to come. The reflection would show them in their final moments, pale and lifeless, staring back at them with a coldness that made your bones shiver. David had always thought it was just a local myth, a scare tactic used to draw in tourists. But when he found himself standing in front of the old house, curiosity got the better of him. He hadn't come for the mirror, not really. He'd come for the history, the architecture. But he couldn't help himself. The idea of the mirror had burrowed itself into his mind, and he needed to see it for himself. The house was dark, old, the kind of house that seemed to breathe on its own, creaking and shifting with every gust of wind. The air inside was thick with the smell of age, of wood and dust and forgotten memories. David walked through the grand halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence, taking in the faded wallpaper and cracked ceilings. And then he saw it. The mirror. It stood in a darkened corner, framed in gold, its surface dusty and cracked. The glass seemed to absorb the light around it, like it was pulling in the shadows. David stood before it, staring at his reflection. It was just him, a tall man in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a tired expression. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but that was nothing new. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror was just a mirror. His heart began to slow, the tension in his chest easing. Maybe it was just a story after all. Maybe he was just being foolish. But then it changed. His reflection flickered, like the glass had shifted for a moment, and then he saw it. His face, pale and drawn, staring back at him. There was no life in the eyes, no warmth, no spark. Just cold, lifeless eyes staring out from a face that seemed to have already passed from this world. His lips were slightly parted, as if in shock, and a faint trickle of blood ran down from his nose, staining his shirt. David's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, blinking hard, but the image remained. His reflection was staring at him, motionless, cold. He could feel a chill running down his spine, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of his neck. It wasn't just a trick of the light. This wasn't some illusion. This was real. He turned away from the mirror, his pulse racing. The air felt thicker now, as if the house itself was pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the image from his mind, the way his reflection had looked, dead and pale. He told himself it was just a mirror, just some old trick of the glass. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see. For the rest of the day, David tried to avoid the mirror. He couldn't stop thinking about it, though. The vision of his own face, pale and lifeless, haunted him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. It was as if the house itself was toying with him, pulling him back to the mirror with every corner he turned, every hallway he walked down, every door he opened. And then it happened again. He was walking past the mirror, trying to keep his head down, when the reflection caught his eye. It was impossible to ignore. The image of himself was there, just like before, but now it was clearer. His face was even more lifeless, his skin a sickly shade of gray. His eyes were open wide, unblinking, staring straight at him with a look of pure terror. Blood pooled at his feet, the dark stain spreading out like ink and water. David gasped, his breath caught in his chest. He stepped back, his hand shaking, but the reflection didn't change. It only grew more vivid, more detailed. It was as though the reflection was drawing him in, showing him exactly how he would die, how he was going to die. His mind raced. He had to get away. He had to leave the house. He had to forget about the mirror, forget about the face that wasn't his anymore. But no matter how fast he walked, no matter how far he ran, the reflection always found him, always grew closer, always more detailed. He could feel it in his bones now, the certainty of his doom. Days passed. David couldn't escape the house. Every time he turned a corner, the mirror was there, waiting for him. The reflection would grow stronger, more vivid, until it was all he could see. The blood on his clothes, the terror in his eyes. The house was alive with it, alive with his death. He tried everything, closing his eyes, turning his back, even covering the mirror with a sheet. But it didn't matter. The image was in his mind now, burned into his brain, impossible to erase. And then, one night, as he walked past the mirror once more, he saw it. The final moment. The moment of his death. The mirror showed him everything. The way his body would fall, the way the blood would spill, the way his eyes would freeze in terror. He didn't need to see it happen to know it was coming. He felt it. David Hall never left the house. They found his body days later, lifeless and pale, with terror etched into his face. And the mirror, it stood silent, as it always had, waiting for the next person to look into it, waiting to show them the moment of their death. Story number 5. The Endless Hallway. There were 5 of them, just 5 teenagers looking for something to make their summer more interesting. They'd heard the stories about the house on the hill, the one everyone whispered about but no one dared to go near. The old Whitmore place, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows broken, its doors hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow anyone stupid enough to enter. But they were stupid and bored. Ben, the ringleader, had dared the others to break in. Just for a thrill, he'd said, grinning like a kid about to steal candy. They all went along with it. Maggie, the quiet one who always tagged along with her friends. Rachel, the jock who usually played it tough but was secretly scared of everything. And then there was Jamie, the kid who always wanted to impress but never thought things through. And finally, there was Tyler, the skeptic. The one who didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that crap. They found their way through the broken fence and into the house, their feet crunching over the weeds that had overtaken the yard. The front door was already hanging loose, like it had been waiting for someone to walk in. The air inside was thick, musty, and smelled like decay, like something had been dead here for years. But they were excited. It was just an old house. Nothing more. It wasn't until they stepped inside that the fun started to feel a little too real. The house was massive, full of dark corners and creaky floors. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the windows cloudy with dirt and age. But there was something off, something wrong about the place. They couldn't put their finger on it at first, just a feeling, like they were being watched, like the house itself was breathing, waiting for them to move. Ben led the way, pushing open a door that creaked too loud for comfort. "This way," he said, his voice a little too eager, a little too far away from the usual bravado. The others followed. The hallway was long, longer than it should have been. The ceiling seemed to stretch up forever, and the floor beneath them groaned as if it hadn't supported anyone in years. They walked in a line, their footsteps echoing off the walls. But it wasn't just their footsteps that filled the silence. There were whispers too, soft at first, almost like a breeze, but the closer they got to the end of the hallway, the louder it became. Ben stopped. "Did you hear that?" Jamie snorted. "It's just the wind, man. It's an old house. Get a grip." But the others had heard it too. Faint voices, like murmurs, just out of reach, whispering in the shadows. They moved forward, unsure of what was really happening, but unwilling to back down now. They turned into a room on the right, the door opening into a space that didn't look like it belonged to the house at all. The furniture was strange. Old chairs with torn upholstery, a fireplace that was too clean to be real, and a painting on the wall of a woman who looked like she was staring right at them. Guys?" Maggie's voice trembled. "This isn't right." But Ben shrugged. "It's an old house, Maggie. Everything's gonna be weird." They left the room and moved deeper into the hallway, only to find that the next door they opened led into another room that didn't make sense. This one was covered in wallpaper that looked fresh, too new for a place that had been abandoned for decades. And there was a mirror, a full-length mirror. But when they looked into it, the reflection wasn't right. It wasn't them standing there. It was something else. Someone else. Someone who didn't belong in the house. They closed the door quickly, their hearts pounding. But as they stepped back into the hallway, things had already begun to change. The air grew colder. The hallway seemed to stretch out even further, impossibly long now, twisting like a snake. The doors they had passed earlier were gone, replaced by more doors that led into more rooms that didn't look like they belonged in any house. Each one felt darker, more twisted, like the walls themselves were pulsing with something unnatural. "This isn't right," Rachel said, her voice shaking now. "We need to get out of here." But Ben didn't listen. He pushed open another door, his hand shaking but his eyes set with determination. Inside was a room full of clocks, old, dusty clocks that all ticked in unison, louder and louder, as if time itself was closing in on them. In the center of the room was a chair, empty, with straps tied around the arms. It was like something out of a nightmare, and the whispers returned, louder now, mocking them. "Turn back," a voice said, one of the whispers. "Turn back before it's too late." They turned to leave the room, but the hallway had changed. It had twisted, stretching farther, and now the doors led nowhere. There was no escape. And then they saw it. At the end of the hallway was a door that didn't look like it belonged to the house at all. It was massive, covered in dark, ancient wood, and as they approached, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "You have to face it," the voice said. Tyler's hand shot out. "Guys, do you see that?" He pointed at the door. But it wasn't just the door, it was the shadow behind it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the doorframe, waiting. "I know who you are," the figure whispered. The door creaked open, revealing the shadowed room beyond. The air was thick with something dark, something ancient. The whispers turned to screams. "We are what you fear," the voice said. And then the house shifted again. The hallway twisted back on itself, becoming a labyrinth of nightmares. The doors opened into rooms that showed the deepest, darkest fears of each of them, things they had hidden in the deepest parts of their hearts. Ben saw his father's face, twisted in rage, while Maggie was trapped in a room with mirrors that showed her deepest insecurities. Rachel found herself alone, back on the football field, but no one could hear her screams as the crowd watched her fail. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place that knew them, that fed on their fears. The hallway was endless, stretching into infinity, and the only way out was to face the darkest parts of themselves, to confront what they had buried in their pasts. One by one, they collapsed. Some screamed, some cried, but none of them could escape. The house had claimed them. They had become part of its maze, lost forever in the endless hallway, their deepest secrets sealed within its walls. The whispers didn't stop. They never would. And the hallway waited for the next group of teenagers foolish enough to enter. Story number 6, The Ghost of Sarah Winchester. Daniel Harris wasn't the superstitious type. He was a man of facts, of research, and that was how he ended up studying the life of Sarah Winchester. He'd heard the stories, of course, the rumors about the widow who had built the Winchester Mystery House to appease the ghosts of those killed by her husband's rifle. It was a strange tale, one of endless construction, of a house that had no rhyme or reason, where doors led to walls and staircases reached up to nothing. Daniel had come to California to conduct research for a book he was writing, something about the myths surrounding haunted places. He'd thought, like so many others, that the Winchester house was nothing more than a quirky bit of history, a fascinating but ultimately harmless relic from a bygone era. But as he spent more time in the house, something changed. Something shifted inside him. It started the first night he stayed in the guest room of the mansion. He hadn't expected anything strange, of course. The house was old, filled with strange architecture, but he'd spent plenty of nights in old houses during his career. There was always a creak here, a groan there. But that night, as he lay in bed, he could have sworn he heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking just outside his door. At first, Daniel ignored it. It was probably just the house settling, he told himself. But then the footsteps stopped, and he heard something else. A faint whisper, like the wind, but almost human. "Help me." He bolted upright, his heart racing. There was nothing in the room with him. The door was locked, the windows shut tight, but the voice had been real, unmistakable. And it wasn't the wind. The next day, he shrugged it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But when he started digging into Sarah Winchester's life, that's when things took a darker turn. Sarah Winchester had been a woman haunted by grief. Grief over the death of her daughter, her husband, and the tragedies that followed. She had become obsessed with spirits, convinced they were the cause of her family's misfortune. The legend went that she had built the house to appease them, to offer them a home so they would leave her family alone. But no matter how many rooms she built, no matter how many staircases she constructed that led to nowhere, the spirits never left. Daniel couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it, something he wasn't seeing. He began visiting the house more frequently, searching for clues, speaking to the guides who worked there, asking about strange occurrences, about unexplained sights and sounds. And that's when it started. The dreams. At first, they were subtle. Faces in the windows, figures standing in the distance just outside his field of vision. But they grew more intense. One night, he dreamed of Sarah Winchester herself, her face pale, her eyes hollow with sorrow. She was standing in the middle of a dark room, surrounded by shadows. "Help me," she whispered in the dream. "Help me finish it." Daniel awoke with a jolt, his body slick with sweat. He didn't understand what she meant. What was it she needed him to finish? He was just a man, a researcher, a writer. But the dreams kept coming, night after night. Each one grew clearer, more urgent. Sarah's presence felt real, as if she were standing right beside him, her cold fingers brushing his arm, her voice echoing in his mind. Finish it. It was after one particularly vivid dream that Daniel began to see the signs. He was walking through the house one afternoon, lost in thought, when he passed a window and saw something. A shadow moving in the distance. It looked like Sarah, her figure indistinct, floating through the garden, disappearing behind a thicket of trees. He tried to follow, but when he reached the spot there was nothing there, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. And then the messages started. Cryptic, strange messages written on the walls of the house. He found them in the dark corners, in the hidden rooms, scrawled in a messy, hurried hand that wasn't there before. "The walls are listening," one of them read. Another said, "He will come for you, but you must finish the work." He was starting to lose sleep, losing himself in the obsession of it all. The messages came faster now, appearing on windows, on mirrors, even on the backs of paintings. It was as if Sarah Winchester's spirit was trying to reach him, trying to tell him something. Then, one night he sat in the study, poring over the blueprints of the house. He was searching for some sort of pattern, some clue to unlock the mystery, when he found it. An old, incomplete design. There, hidden in the margins, were sketches of a room that was never built. It wasn't in any of the house's plans, not in the public records. It was a room that would have been built if Sarah had ever finished her work. That was when Daniel understood. He wasn't just studying Sarah's life anymore. He was becoming part of it. He was being drawn into her unfinished story, pulled into the web she had woven for herself all those years ago. He was the one who had to finish the house. He had to build the room. And as soon as he made the decision, the house responded. The walls seemed to groan with anticipation, the air growing thicker, heavier. The dreams became more real, and Sarah's presence felt stronger, closer. The whispers became clearer, demanding, desperate. "Finish it," she would say, over and over again, her voice now a frantic cry. He couldn't stop himself. The more he tried to resist, the more the house pulled him in. He began to design the room, sketching it out late at night, as though Sarah's spirit was guiding his hand. But as he worked, he realized the terrifying truth. Sarah hadn't just built the house to appease the spirits. She had built it to trap them. Trapped herself, trapped the souls of the dead, and now the house was trapping him too. One night, Daniel finally broke. The room was completed, every detail, every corner, every inch of it. He stepped inside, and as the door clicked shut behind him, he knew it was too late. The house had claimed him. Sarah's ghost had gotten what she needed. The last thing Daniel saw was Sarah Winchester standing at the door of the room, her hollow eyes staring back at him, her lips forming the final words he would ever hear. "Now, you are part of the house forever." And the house, which had never truly finished, never stopped building, kept growing, waiting for the next soul to finish its work. Story number 7. The Door That Never Opens. Mark Darnell had never been a believer in myths. He was a man of reason, of logic, and that was exactly why the story of the door in the old house intrigued him so much. The house was a local legend, a place that seemed to hold more questions than answers. People talked about it in whispers, the kind of whispers you didn't want to hear at night, the kind that made you question what you thought you knew. The house, a decaying mansion on the edge of town, had been abandoned for years. It stood like a silent sentinel, watching the world pass by as time gnawed away at its bones. The stories surrounding it were endless. Strange noises, flickering lights, rooms that seemed to shift when no one was looking. But the one story that always stuck out to Mark was the one about the door. They said it was in the farthest corner of the house, hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs. No one knew what was behind it, because it had never been opened. The legend went that whoever tried to open the door would be cursed to relive their worst moment, over and over again, as if they were trapped in some sort of twisted nightmare. Mark had heard the tale countless times, but it was always just that. A tale, a myth, a silly story meant to scare kids and thrill seekers. But he was different. He was a man who didn't scare easily. And something about that door, about the idea of something locked away in the heart of the house, began to gnaw at him. What was behind it? What made it so dangerous? The curiosity became a hunger, a need to know. It was a feeling that crept up on him slowly at first, then grew into an obsession. One day, when the house was silent and empty, Mark decided he would see for himself. He would open the door. The house creaked as he walked through it, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling away in places like old skin, exposing the rotting bones beneath. Mark's footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the house, searching for the door. It was at the end of a long, narrow hallway, tucked away in a corner as if trying to hide itself. The door was made of heavy wood, dark and worn with age, its brass handle tarnished and slick with years of dust. He stood in front of it, his hand hovering over the handle, a thrill running through him. It was ridiculous, he thought. Just a door. A silly old myth. Nothing could happen. He reached for the handle, and as his fingers made contact, a shiver ran through him. The handle was cold, colder than it should have been. His heart thudded against his ribs as he turned it. The door creaked open with a slow, mournful groan. At first, there was nothing. The room beyond the door was dark, too dark to make out any details. But then, Mark stepped inside, and the air changed. It felt heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere had changed. And then it happened. The world shifted. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the floor beneath him seemed to tilt. The darkness was overwhelming, suffocating. The air felt wrong. He stumbled forward, disoriented, and suddenly he was no longer in the room behind the door. He was back. It was his mother's house, but it didn't look the same. The furniture was different, the layout wrong. It was the house he had grown up in, but somehow not. And there, standing in the doorway, was his mother, smiling at him, her eyes kind but distant. "Mark," she said, her voice sweet, but there was something off about it. "You've come back." Mark's breath caught in his throat. His mother had died years ago, in a car accident that had shattered his world. The memory was a wound that never healed. But here she was, standing in front of him, as real as the house that surrounded him. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The smile on her face faded. "You should have been there, Mark. You should have saved me." Suddenly, the room began to shift again. The walls distorted. The air became thick with smoke. The sound of screeching tires filled his ears, the sound of metal tearing through metal. He saw the car, his mother's car, flipping through the air, crashing into a tree, the glass shattering as he stood frozen, helpless. Mark tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The scene repeated, over and over, each time more vivid, more painful. He could feel the terror in his chest, the rush of panic, the helplessness that had consumed him in that moment when he had watched his mother die and couldn't do a thing about it. "Save me, Mark," his mother's voice cried out from the wreckage, her hand reaching toward him. But he couldn't move. He couldn't reach her. And then it all snapped back. The scene disappeared, and Mark was once again standing in front of the door, his hand still gripping the cold handle. His heart was racing, his body drenched in sweat. He could hear his breathing, shallow and ragged, echoing in the empty hallway. But the worst part wasn't that the scene had played out. It was the fact that it had never stopped. The moment, that horrible moment, was still with him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. It was real. He was living it again, trapped in that moment, unable to escape. He tried to pull away from the door, but the world around him shifted once more. The hallway stretched out, pulling him back. He was back in the crash, feeling the terror, hearing the scream of metal against metal, the sound of his mother's voice begging him to save her. And then, as the scene looped again, he realized he wasn't going anywhere. The door had done its job. It had cursed him. The myth wasn't just a story. The door didn't just show you your worst moment. It trapped you in it forever. Mark screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, as the door that never opened closed behind him, locking him in a never-ending nightmare. Story number 8. The Haunted Organ. James Franklin didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in spirits or curses or any of that nonsense. But after everything that had happened, he didn't really believe in much at all anymore. His wife, Emily, had died 2 years ago in a car accident, and ever since he had been living a half-life, going through the motions, existing but not living. His daughter, Lily, had been taken from him soon after, placed in foster care, a cruel reminder of the hole Emily's death had left in their lives. Now, alone and broken, James found himself standing in front of the old house on the outskirts of town, a place that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It had been his grandmother's house, the place where he had spent his summers as a boy, a place filled with memories of a time when life seemed simple, before tragedy had come knocking. He hadn't come to find solace, not exactly. There was no peace to be found, no sense of closure. But maybe, just maybe, the old house could help him forget. The way the walls creaked in the night, the way the dust settled like a forgotten secret. Maybe that was enough to drown out the memories, to bury the ache in his chest, even if only for a little while. He stepped through the front door, the hinges groaning in protest. The house smelled the same, musty, old, and cold, but it was home in a way. He walked through the dark hallways, his footsteps echoing off the walls, until he reached the sitting room. That's when he heard it. The sound was faint at first, just a whisper of music, a melody he couldn't quite place. He turned his head, confused. There, at the far end of the room, stood an organ, its large pipes towering over the dust-covered floor. It was the kind of organ you'd see in a church, the kind that commanded attention with its presence. But there was no one there. The music grew louder, the haunting melody filling the space around him. It was strange, beautiful, but also wrong. The notes didn't sound like something you'd hear in a symphony. They were out of place, twisted in a way that made his skin crawl. It was as if the music was trying to tell him something, beckoning him closer. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of the organ. His fingers brushed the dusty keys, and the music seemed to shift. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it was a voice. James. The voice was low, sweet, almost soothing, but there was something in it that made his stomach turn. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know who or what was speaking to him, but it didn't matter. He couldn't move. The voice pulled him in, wrapping around him like a thick fog, suffocating him with its promise. "James," the voice said again, more insistent this time. "I can give you what you've lost. I can bring her back, your Emily, and your daughter." His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Could it be? Could this house, this organ, really offer him the one thing he wanted more than anything else? The chance to see Emily again, to hold Lily in his arms? The voice seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's simple," it whispered. "You need only ask. I can bring them back to you, but you must play the song. You must play the organ, and everything you desire will be yours." James hesitated. He had nothing left to lose, nothing but grief and loneliness. And yet, the price, what was the price? He glanced at the organ again, its pipes looming like a specter in the room. The music called to him, wrapping around his mind like tendrils, urging him to play. Without thinking, he sat down on the bench, his fingers brushing against the keys. The melody flowed from him effortlessly, as if the music had already taken root in his mind. The notes seemed to swirl around him, filling the room with a kind of energy, a vibration he couldn't explain. And with each note, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker. At first, nothing happened. He kept playing, the haunting music filling the space, echoing in his ears. But then, something changed. He felt a pull, a strange tug at the center of his chest, as though something was being drawn out of him. The music grew louder. The room seemed to warp, the shadows twisting around him like they were alive. And that's when he saw it. A vision, like a photograph coming into focus. His wife, Emily. She was standing before him, her smile as warm as it had been on their wedding day. Her eyes, her beautiful eyes, looked at him with love. But there was something else there, something he couldn't understand. She reached out to him, her hands trembling. "James," she whispered, her voice distant, as if calling from beyond a veil. "James, don't." But it was too late. The music had already taken hold. The organ's keys pressed down on their own, faster, harder, the sound growing more frantic with every passing second. The vision of Emily began to fade, replaced by another image. His daughter, Lily. Her face twisted in pain, her mouth open in a silent scream. James pulled his hands away from the keys, his body trembling with fear. But the music didn't stop. It kept playing, the melody growing darker, more insistent. And that's when he realized it. The price. The organ wasn't offering him what he wanted. It was offering him a chance to relive the worst moments of his life over and over again. The more he played, the more his soul was being drained, piece by piece, note by note. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't obey. The music wrapped around him like chains, pulling him back, forcing him to play. Each note bled into the next, each moment of his grief and regret swirling together in a nightmarish loop. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. But the organ's music only grew louder, drowning him out. "Please, stop." But it didn't stop. It couldn't. The organ had taken its toll. It had claimed him. And so James sat there, trapped in the house, his soul slowly slipping away with every note until the haunting melody became his life and death. Story number 9. The Cursed Family. When the letter arrived, it felt like the answer to every dream Aaron Parker had ever had. The family had always struggled, barely scraping by in their cramped house on the outskirts of town. But this was different. This was a chance for something more. A chance to finally leave behind the small, suffocating life they had lived for so long. The letter said it all. You have inherited the Winchester Mystery House. Congratulations. At first, Aaron thought it was some kind of joke, but as he read through the details, the gravity of it sank in. The Winchester House, the mansion at the edge of town that had stood for over a century, full of strange architecture and endless rumors. The house that had belonged to Sarah Winchester, the widow of the inventor of the rifle. People said the house was haunted, that Sarah had built it to appease the spirits of those killed by her husband's invention. Some said she was driven mad by grief and fear, but none of that mattered to Aaron. The house was his now, and with it came a fortune beyond his wildest imagination. Aaron shared the news with his wife, Laura, and their 2 teenage children, Sam and Ellie. They were just as stunned as he was, but the excitement quickly took over. Moving into a mansion like the Winchester House was every family's dream, right? It seemed like the perfect escape. A new beginning. The chance to live in a house that would be the envy of everyone they knew. They packed their things, left behind the small, tired house they had called home for years, and made the journey to the mansion. The drive up to the house was surreal. An enormous building that seemed to rise from the ground like something out of a fairy tale. The house stood tall against the sky, its walls crumbling in places, but still magnificent in its own way. The air was thick with history, with the weight of all the years it had stood, but as soon as they stepped inside, Aaron felt it. A chill. A strange heaviness in the air that he couldn't explain. Laura seemed to feel it too, her eyes darting around as if searching for something. Sam and Ellie ran ahead, excited by the sheer size of the place, but Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first night, everything seemed fine. The house was large, with rooms and hallways that twisted in strange ways. There was so much to explore. But as the days went by, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The house seemed to have a life of its own, creaking floors, strange whispers in the walls, shadows that moved just out of sight. And then, things started to happen. Small things at first, flickering lights, doors that wouldn't open or close properly, footsteps that echoed when no one was around. but it was the dreams that truly began to unsettle them. Aaron dreamed of a tall figure, a woman with hollow eyes, standing at the foot of his bed, her face a mask of sorrow and rage. In the dream, she whispered his name over and over until it felt like the walls were closing in on him. When he woke up, his heart was pounding, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. Laura began to have her own dreams. She dreamed of the house in its prime, of Sarah Winchester walking through the halls, her eyes empty, her steps echoing in the silence. The woman would stop, turn, and smile at her. Only it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone before you know you're going to hurt them. And then the kids. Sam had a nightmare about a dark figure chasing him through endless corridors. Ellie, always the curious one, began to explore the house's many rooms. She found a door hidden behind a tapestry, a door that had no right to be there. It led to a small, dark room where she found an old rocking chair. As she sat in it, the chair began to rock back and forth by itself. Ellie swore she heard a voice calling her name, a voice that sounded like her mother's but wrong, distorted, hollow. By the time the third week came around, the house's grip on the family had tightened. They couldn't leave. There was no way out. Every time they tried to pack their things and go, the doors seemed to lock themselves, the car wouldn't start, or a strange fog would roll in, trapping them inside. They were prisoners in their own home. But it wasn't just the house. The house seemed to know them, know their deepest fears, their darkest secrets. Aaron began to see things, visions of his past mistakes, of times when he had failed those he loved. In the dead of night, he would hear his children's voices calling to him, but when he reached their rooms, they were empty. The house was feeding on his regrets, drawing them out into the open. Every room he entered showed him a new version of himself, one that he didn't recognize, one that he couldn't face. Laura, too, began to unravel. She found herself drawn to a room in the house that looked like a replica of their old home, only twisted and wrong. She would sit in that room for hours, staring at the cracked photo frames, haunted by memories of the life they had lost. The house was taunting her, reminding her of everything she couldn't change. Sam and Ellie were not immune either. Sam started withdrawing, speaking less and less, his eyes clouded with fear. He refused to sleep alone, terrified that something would come for him in the night. Ellie, always the brave one, began to question everything about the house. She would stay up late, reading old journals she found hidden in the walls, journals that told stories of curses, of a family driven mad by their own guilt. She discovered that the Winchester family was not just haunted by the ghosts of the past. It was haunted by a curse that had passed down through generations. A curse that had driven Sarah Winchester to build the house, and that had now claimed her family. One night, after reading the journals, Ellie confronted her parents. "It's the house," she said, her voice shaking. "It's the curse. It's been with the family for years. Sarah Winchester couldn't escape it, and neither can we." Aaron didn't want to believe it, but the longer they stayed, the more he saw, the more they all saw. The house was alive with the curse, feeding on their fears, their guilt, their weaknesses. It had been waiting for them. It had always been waiting. As the days turned into weeks and the family began to break down, they realized that there was no escaping it. The curse of the Winchester family had passed on to them. They were trapped, bound by the sins of those who had come before. And the house would never let them go. In the end, the family was consumed. Their bodies disappeared, their minds shattered, until the house stood empty once more, waiting for the next family to fall victim to the curse that had haunted the Winchester bloodline for generations. And and the house would wait, as it always had, for the next unlucky soul to claim. Story number 10. The Clock That Never Stops. Jack Winters had always been the kind of man who believed in facts. He wasn't one to get wrapped up in legends or spooky stories, but when he moved into the old house, there was something about it, something that gnawed at him deep down. The house itself wasn't much to look at. It was old, the kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere, tucked away behind overgrown hedges and forgotten roads. The kind of house people drove by without a second glance. But it had been his family's inheritance, passed down from a distant uncle who had died under mysterious circumstances, and now it was his. When Jack first entered the house, everything seemed normal, even a bit charming. The creaky wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, and the smell of dust mixed with the musty scent of old wood. But there was one thing that stood out: an old clock hanging on the wall in the living room. It was massive, its face cracked and yellowed with age, its brass hands frozen in place. The clock had been there as long as anyone could remember, and it was the one thing in the house that never stopped ticking. But the hands? They never moved forward. At first, Jack didn't think much of it. He had a lot on his mind, things to fix around the house, bills to pay, life to live. But as the days went by, that clock became impossible to ignore. The sound of the ticking filled the house, echoing in every room, like some maddening whisper in the back of his mind. Tick, tick, tick. It was always there. But the hands, they never moved. The more Jack stared at it, the more it bothered him. He couldn't understand it. A clock that ticked endlessly but never advanced. It was as if it was frozen in time, stuck at some moment that wouldn't pass. And the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just a clock anymore. It was a reminder of something. Something hidden in the house that Jack couldn't put his finger on. One evening, after dinner, Jack sat in the living room, his eyes fixated on the clock. It was late, and the only sound was the ticking. Tick, tick, tick. The hands remained still, stuck at exactly 6:03. Jack had tried everything, taking the clock down, winding it, adjusting the hands, but it always returned to that same spot. It was as if the clock was mocking him, refusing to move, refusing to let time go forward. And then it happened. At first, Jack thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. The room around him seemed to distort, the edges of his vision blurring, like he was looking through a foggy window. The ticking grew louder, faster, and before he knew it, he was standing, his legs unsteady, his mind racing. The clock's hands hadn't moved, but time seemed to be shifting around him. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, until the whole room felt wrong. Jack stumbled toward the door, his breath shallow, but when he reached for the handle, he found himself in the same spot, staring at the clock. The hands were still stuck at 6:03. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned around and saw the same chair he had just been sitting in, the same dust settling on the floor, the same crack in the wall that had been there when he first walked in. "What the hell is going on?" Jack muttered, his voice barely a whisper. But no answer came. The ticking continued, tick, tick, tick. Hours, or was it days, passed, and the house began to feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in. Jack could no longer tell where the house ended and his own mind began. It was as if he had become trapped in the clock itself, forced to live in this endless loop of time that was slowly strangling him. Every time he looked at the clock, the hands were still frozen at 6:03, but the ticking never stopped. It was always there, always relentless, like a heartbeat echoing through his veins. Jack couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, no matter what he did, the house and the clock had him in their grip. As days turned into weeks, Jack began to lose his sense of reality. He would try to leave, but the door would never open. He'd find himself standing in the same room, staring at the same clock, watching the same hands that refused to move forward. Every time he tried something different, every time he tried to break the cycle, he would end up right back in front of that damned clock. It was as if time itself had twisted and contorted around him, trapping him in a moment that would never pass. The ticking grew louder. It filled his mind, drowning out all thought, until all he could hear was that incessant sound, tick, tick, tick. He could feel it pulling at him, dragging him deeper into the house, deeper into the madness. And then, one night, something shifted. The house groaned, the floorboards creaked, and Jack felt the walls bend inward, as if the entire structure was about to collapse. He rushed toward the clock, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, everything stopped. The ticking, the noise, the pressure. It all stopped, leaving a suffocating silence. For a brief moment, he thought he was free. But then he saw it. The clock's hands had moved, just one tick forward. And with that tick, everything shifted again. The house began to crumble, the walls splintering, the ceiling sagging. Jack's heart raced as he tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was collapsing inward, folding in on him, trapping him in the one moment that would never end. The clock was the house was the clock, and with every tick, he was being pulled closer to the house's tragic fate. The collapse, the destruction, the end. He was part of it now, trapped in the loop forever. The last thing Jack heard was the ticking, always the ticking, until it swallowed him whole. And the clock never stopped.